Before we get started on today's story, I have exciting news. A lot of you have been asking about a Please Leave Patreon, and we're very happy to announce that we will be launching one on February 1st. For as little as $3 a month, you will have access to at least one bonus narrative episode per month, as well as weekly behind-the-scenes conversations with my collaborator, horror bestie, and the host of This May Hurt a Bit podcast, James Strayer. We'll be talking about what inspires us, what the process is for making and consuming horror, and most of all, what scares us. We will also be offering Please Leave merchandise for subscribers at higher tiers, so take a look and sign up for more horror content. And now on to today's tale of terror.
Welcome to Please Leave Podcast, where you'll hear truly scary stories that you cannot get out of your head. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence or explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
I'm not sure if it's my lack of ambition or my general distaste for people that drove me to take a job as a third-shift 999 operator in the middle of nowhere, but it suits me beautifully. The only calls we really get after 11 p.m. are from irate residents who want us to collect their drunk spouses, or for attempted break-ins by woodland creatures with snack infatuations. So it's the perfect job for a semi-lazy introvert like me. I'm the only operator on shift at night, so after I say my goodbyes to the afternoon crew, it's just me and the consistent hum of electronics in the darkened call center for a full 8 hours, and I couldn't be happier about it. I pass the time with online games and the occasional novel, but half the time, I just relish how clear my thoughts come through in the absence of other people and their pesky expectations. I'm a simple man, and I love my simple job. Anne and Dave were packing up their bags when I arrived tonight, and we shared our usual pleasantries as I claimed my station and shrugged off my coat. I actually like Anne, with her dry wit and inability to give much of a fuck, and so I always give her a little extra attention when we cross paths. The two things she hates most in life are the ostentatious jeans that young women wear these days, and her husband George, who she's been with since she was 15 years old, and so I always made a point to ask about him, just to see her bristle a bit. "How's George been, Anne?" I asked, as she struggled with the oversized winter coat that she should have retired several seasons ago. She huffed loudly, and I stifled a laugh. "That man is a few sandwiches short of a picnic, I tell you." She shook her head as she pushed past Dave and nearly knocked him over the desk he was standing next to. She opened the door to leave, and then turned to share one final thought. "If I had to do it over again, I think I'd have been with a woman instead." She looked out the door wistfully, and then turned back one more time. "I've no real interest in exploring another woman's bits, but it's got to be better than being with a man for 47 years. And with that, she stepped out into the night, slammed the door behind her, and was gone. A second later, Dave shot me a timid wave before disappearing behind Anne, and just as it had been for most nights for the 3 years before, the place was all mine. I followed the same routine every night. I'd relocate my lunch to the small staff fridge, and then make myself the strongest cup of coffee the pod-style pot would allow, while I scavenged the cabinets in the break room for any forgotten food items. Tonight, I struck gold when I found a discarded granola bar in a blind spot on one of the shelves, and I did a little happy dance as I brought my coffee and my snack back to my desk to settle in for the quiet night ahead. I was particularly excited for my shift because my cousin had left a detective novel behind when he'd visited the week before, and I'd become completely engrossed by the story, but it was poorly written to the point of being embarrassing. Despite being someone who couldn't care less about the opinions of other people, I refused to read it in a place where anyone could potentially catch a glimpse, and so I was extra excited to have the whole shift to enjoy the tacky adventures of the fictional DI alone. Around midnight, I was completely absorbed in the first big reveal in the novel, where the detective discovered an earring matching the one the victim had been wearing on the night she was murdered in his partner's apartment. And I just exclaimed, "Oh no, not D.I. Thomas," out loud to myself when my phone rang and startled me so badly I nearly tossed the paper back. I pulled up my headset from where it rested around my neck, then wiggled the mouse to wake up the computer screen, and answered the call like I had 1,000 times before. "Police emergency, how can I help you?" There was a muffled sound of young people laughing on the other side of the line for a moment, and then a preteen voice said, "Is my cunt there?" Followed by another eruption of juvenile laughter. "Do you know that it's a criminal offence to make prank calls, especially to emergency services? It's a crime punishable by a steep fine and jail time, as it turns out." A part of me was proud of the young men for following in the footsteps of so many adolescents before them, but I was on a recorded line, so I wasn't about to encourage their illegal behaviour, even though it very much made my night. The laughter abruptly stopped as the kid ended the call, and I smiled, remembering all of the nights my best friend Leo and I had spent tormenting the elderly residents of our village in the days before caller ID. Modern-day prank callers were either ballsy or stupid, or both, but it warmed my heart that they were carrying on the obnoxious rite of passage in my rural town. I reached for my coffee and was disappointed to find that I'd drained the mug while I distractedly read my book, and so got up to make another cup to get me through the night. I popped another pod into the machine, dropped the lid and pressed the button, then leaned against the counter and closed my eyes for a moment, while I relived more memories of my sleepovers with Leo as a kid. I was halfway through a memory of Leo's 8th birthday when we'd buried his sister's dolls in the garden so that only their heads were visible above ground, when I was startled back to reality by a loud screeching sound off in the distance. It sounded like the scream of a freight train engaging its brakes, but there were no trains for miles. The 999 call centre butted up against several acres of woods, and so there was no plausible way I'd hit a night train, and I walked to the window to investigate. Occasionally I would hear the awful cries of a rabbit as a fox or owl caught up with it and snared it with sharp teeth or talons, and I wondered if that was what I'd heard as I strained to see into the dark of the woods behind the building. I had my hands cupped around my face as I pressed as close as I could get to the glass, and I nearly chipped a tooth against the window as another call rang out through the quiet office. I rushed back to my desk, awkwardly replaced my headset and answered the call. "Police emergency, how can I help you?" There were several moments of silence, punctuated by the rustling sound of what must have been a hand or some fabric against the phone, and then another young male voice said in a tone just above a whisper, "I think she's back." "Listen, kid, I already told you that prank calling is a crime. It was funny the first time, but if you call back again, I'll be forced to alert the police." The line was quiet for another moment, and then the voice whispered again, "I think she's back. I think Dark Mommy is back." I pushed back from my desk as I contemplated what the boy was saying, and asked, "Is your mummy okay? Is something wrong with your mummy?" "Yes," the boy hissed, and I could hear the fear in his response. "She got them. Dark Mommy got them. I thought she was gone, but she's back." "Oh, okay, son. Is Dark Mommy in your house? Is she dangerous?" There was another muffled bumpy sound, like the phone being dropped on a thick rug, and a couple of seconds later the boy returned to the line. "She got the grown-ups." I could hear a loud sound in the background, like a violent tapping against a thick pane of glass. The little boy whimpered and then whispered, "She's here. Please help." A half-second later, he screamed, "No!" and the line went dead. I sat, stunned for a moment, processing the conversation and trying to decide if it was indeed another prank or if the boy had been in real distress. He hadn't made any sense with his talk of a dark mummy, but if there is anything I've learned as a 999 operator, it's that it's better to be safe than sorry. I pulled up the GPS of the caller's location, then contacted dispatch to inform them of the strange call. I let them know of the earlier prank, and they said they would send someone by to investigate, just to be sure. The boy had sounded legitimately scared, and I said a little prayer that it had been a prank, because otherwise, that boy was in serious trouble. I shook off the creepy feeling that lingered after the call, then headed back into the kitchen to retrieve my abandoned coffee. It had cooled past my liking while I was taking the call, and so I repeated the process to brew another. As I was waiting for the third brew to conclude, I decided to take another peek outside to confirm there weren't any threats looming at the forest's edge. The strange screeching sound and upsetting call had unnerved me a bit, and I knew I wouldn't be able to relax and enjoy the rest of my book if I didn't take a last look. Once again, I pressed my face against the glass and cupped my hands around my eyes to block out any light, then strained to see into the dark yard of the call centre. The stretch of lawn between the building and the trees was completely empty, so I scanned the visible stretch of forest, starting the furthest left that I could see and slowly moving right. The only movement was the occasional dried leaf shivering at the end of a limb, or the soft sway of the underbrush. And just as I thought the coast was clear and was about to pull back, I spotted something in the shadows of the trees just past the point that I could see clearly. I repositioned myself so that I could focus on that spot, and squinted my eyes almost painfully to make out whatever was moving in the woods. It took a couple of seconds for my eyes to adjust, and once they did, it looked like a tall, thin, black tent-shaped object swaying back and forth to some inaudible beat. It immediately conjured a memory of a time I watched cartoons at my grandparents' house, and they only had 2 clear channels, so my options for entertainment were limited. Luckily, one of the channels was playing some black and white cartoons, and I clearly remembered sitting in front of their bulky television, totally captivated and slightly horrified by a row of wiggly dancing skeletons, gyrating side to side in an unnaturally fluid motion. Whatever it was in the woods looked just like that, undulating from bottom to top and then back again in a hypnotic and terrifying solo woodland dance. Before I could decide what to do next, the shrill ring of the phone sent a jolt of fear through my body, and I took one last glance at the strange being in the trees before answering the call. "Police emergency, how may I help you?" This time there was no frightened voice on the other side. Just the distinct and soul-rending sound of a young girl screaming from pure fear. I could hear the terror in her voice as she shrieked on and on, without breathing or breaking or crying or asking for help. She just screamed and screamed, and before I could ask her what was happening, the line went dead. And the silence that followed was an equal assault on my ringing ears. I realized I was shaking. And in 3 years as an emergency operator, I'd never encountered anything close to fear, or even mild inconvenience, and I struggled to process what was happening and who was scaring the children in my town. Before I had any time to think, the loud screeching sound I'd heard earlier ripped through the night again, but this time it felt much closer. I ran back to the kitchen and looked out of the window again, silently cursing it for being an inadequate portal for assessing night terrors. The angle was all wrong for clearly seeing whatever was waiting and moving in the forest, and the single pane of glass made me feel much more vulnerable as I pushed my soft face and defenseless watery eyes up against it. I searched for the dancing object in the woods, and it didn't take me long to find it, as it had moved a few feet closer to my office building since I'd last looked. It looked like a very tall, thin person dressed in a black coat from head to toe, with a point at the top like a skinny circus tent. It continued to sway, simultaneously moving from side to side and from top to bottom. I stood on my tiptoes and leaned in as close as I could, and as I shifted, another figure came into frame on my far right. I jumped back for a second, startled by the reveal, and then repositioned so that I could get a better look at who else was in the yard of my work building at 1:30 in the morning. I was able to achieve a slightly better position, and gasped when I realized that what I was seeing was the tattered sleeve of Anne's ancient winter coat, waving side to side in perfect rhythm with the cloaked figure. I glanced back and forth between Anne's arm and the figure several times, mystified by the strange ritual playing out in front of me. As strange as it was, a part of me was excited to give Anne shit for whatever this was, but the excitement was quickly overshadowed by fear as I came into the realization of how truly strange the situation was. Is Anne in trouble? I wondered, then immediately answered, "Of course she is. Of course Anne is in trouble. Dowdy, angry Anne would never be caught dead participating in some cult-like midnight dance party." And so I threw on my coat and headed outside to figure out exactly what was going on. I rounded the side of the building that led to the backyard and stopped abruptly as the full scene unfolded before me. In the bright light of the moon, I could clearly see Anne in the coat she'd been wearing when she'd left, and her purse and lunch bag was still clutched in her hand, swaying back and forth like a 60s child of love who was just getting warmed up at the beginning of a Grateful Dead show. Her shoulders swayed right as her hips tilted left, and her knees jutted out in the same direction as her shoulders. Back and forth she danced, while locked in a trance-like stare into the woods. But that wasn't even the strangest part. Next to Anne stood Dave, trapped in the same strange jig. And next to Dave were two other men, and a woman who I recognized as one of the waitresses from the cafe down the street. All five of them rocking and swaying in perfect beat, and all staring straight ahead into the woods without speaking, or emoting, or calling for help. I slowly turned my head toward the woods, afraid to confront the cloaked figure, but not having any other choice if I wanted to understand exactly what was going on. The figure stood at the edge of the woods, leading the 5 townspeople in the world's strangest dance class, and I could have sworn I could hear a faint beat starting to build inside my own chest. I stared at the dancing body, suddenly fully transfixed by the movement. And the head swiveled to reveal a ghoulish white face that was neither man nor woman, with no mouth and coal black eyes. I stared at the demonic face, and even though the mouth was absent, I could somehow tell that it was smiling. The children finally stopped screaming yesterday. I could hear a little boy wailing for hours down the street, but he stopped just after the sun went down. I finally fell down yesterday too. My feet and knees gave out, and I fell, face first, into an awkward position slightly downhill. And so here I lay, with my face pressed sideways into the wet grass, and my body splayed out over the lawn, forever shifting back and forth, in the eternal dance of the accursed. The calls are still coming in, but they've slowed down in the last 3 days. I'm not sure who's left to call, but every few hours I can hear the desperate ring signaling that someone is still reaching out for help. Someone, somewhere, is cradling the phone, trying to hang on to the futile hope that there will be someone on the other side. Someone who can reassure and help and strategize and advise. But there is no one. There is nothing but a rain-soaked lawn full of the writhing doomed, condemned to dance until our bodies release us into whatever hell lies beyond this mortal plane, ready to embrace us, ready to consume our souls.
This story was written by Courtney Eck and narrated by Benjamin Chandler. For more scary stories that you cannot get out of your head, please join our Patreon at patreon.com/PleaseLeavePod. Please follow Please Leave on Facebook and Instagram at Please Leave Pod. Our email is pleaseleavepod@gmail.com, and our website is pleaseleavepod.com. This has been a Two Penguins Media production.